Hi, everyone. My name's Scalf. I'm an Egyptologist at the Oriental Institute, where I run the Research Archives Library. And today, I'm going to be talking to you about the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. This presentation is part of a larger series of workshops on ancient literature that the OI has been putting on. And I hope that you do check out some of the other ones, including those on the Iliad, general introductions, ancient Egyptian love poetry, Hadrian's autobiography, and the Arabian Nights. In this presentation, what I want to do is use two Book of the Dead scrolls, long scrolls on papyrus, that are housed in the Oriental Institute Museum collection. We'll use these scrolls as illustrative examples of what the Book of the Dead is and also what it was in ancient Egypt. Just a bit of a warning for those of you watching, we will be using a zoom feature to zoom in and out on the papyri that you see on the screen. So there will be some motion involved as we go through this presentation. The first Book of the Dead papyrus that I want to look at is this one, the Book of the Dead of a man named Irtyuru. Sometimes we call this Papyrus Milbank, after the individual who donated money to the Oriental Institute to purchase this papyrus. It was purchased in Egypt from an antiquities dealer in 1919 by James Henry Breasted. It dates to the Ptolemaic period, sometime roughly around, let's say, 200 BC, and is almost 35 feet long in total length. Now, when we think of the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, we have certain impressions in our mind based on how we refer to it. So, for example, we call it a book. And of course, a long Book of the Dead papyrus like this one is very similar to modern books in the sense that sheets of papyrus, like sheets of paper, in this case, were glued together to form a long scroll. So they're not a codex book, but in many other ways, the pages and the scroll serve the same purpose for the material background to the text. I should also mention at this point that Book of the Dead text, and I'm going to refer to most of these as spells. You will also hear people refer to them as chapters, but the texts on the Book of the Dead are not only written on papyri, but pretty much on any other available surface that the ancient Egyptians had. For example, tomb walls, scarabs, ushabtis, leather, mummy bandages made of linen, and etc. Anything you could write on, the ancient Egyptians inscribed with these Book of the Dead spells. Now, often you might think when we call something the Book of the Dead, that it's a narrative text that starts at the beginning, in this case on the right side, with something like once upon a time, or then it happened, and ends at the left side in this case with some kind of ending. But that's not what the Book of the Dead actually is. The Book of the Dead was a compilation of individual shorter texts. We refer to them as spells or chapters that were compiled onto these longer papyrus examples. So, for example, in this section you're looking at here, the individual spells are separated by what we call rubrics, or sections written in red. And you can see the very beginning of the papyrus in the upper right, where it says recitation by Osiris Irtyuru. Irtyuru was the man who owned or commissioned this particular papyrus. And you can see these rubrics throughout this section. Here's the rubric highlighted to spell 2, a spell for going forth by day. Also the title for spell 3, another spell like it, spell 4, and here spell 6, the very famous spell that's associated with the Ushabti figures. And these Ushabtis were sort of avatars for the deceased. And this spell was meant to sort of activate them in order to do work in the necropolis on the deceased behalf. So in this way, the Book of the Dead is not really a book as we tend to think of it. That is, it's not one single composition and it's not one narrative, but it's a long compilation of these individual spells. And from one spell to the other, the content may not necessarily be related. But as we'll see throughout this presentation, the Book of the Dead spells are sort of gathered together into sections that deal with similar topics. And then those sections are organized on the papyrus. Now, you may have heard of these rubrics before. You see it in medieval manuscripts all the time. these sections that are written in red. But one thing I want to point out is that not every word that's written in red is necessarily a rubric in the terms of a spell title or separating one spell from the other. That's a very common use, but not the only. So for example, you can see here highlighted on the screen in the white box, a number of times the word hefty or heftiyu, the word for enemy, is written here in red. And this is often done with, let's say, dangerous words or the name of the god Seth. So you can see here a number of these examples of the word hefty written in red. Likewise, if you look towards the left, at the end of spell 1, we have a section written in red, which is sort of a rubric ending the spell that indicates sometimes where it could be useful or whom it might be useful for. So for example, what you see highlighted on the screen says, as for the one who knows this book upon earth, he will, and then the text continues in the next line. So for example, he will place it upon his coffin and he will be able to go forth in the day. So you can see that these rubrics perform multiple functions. One, to highlight the titles and separate one spell from the other, but then also to indicate rubrics and specialized words. Now, the Book of the Dead for us in English seems to have a title. We call it the Book of the Dead. But of course, the ancient Egyptians didn't call it that. The term Book of the Dead came about in the middle of the 19th century when Carl Richard Lepsius published sort of the first hand copy edition of a full Book of the Dead papyrus, and he called it the Totenbuch. And then later scholars followed that, translating it into English as Book of the Dead. And that may have some other origins that's discussed in the literature. But for the ancient Egyptians, they referred to these as spells of going forth by day. And you can see here highlighted on the screen, this is what many people refer to as the title of the Book of the Dead. But notice here in Irtyuru's papyrus, it starts out actually beginning of the spells of going forth by day. And what I really want to point out here is notice that for the Egyptians, spells is plural. The Book of the Dead is not a singular thing for them. It's a compilation of these individual spells. Sure, sometimes it can be called a medjot, that is a scroll or a book in ancient Egyptian, but this book was a compilation of these individual spells. And even though spells of going forth by day sounds like the ancient Egyptian title for this composition, I do just want to point out that actually it's more of a descriptor. And that descriptor, that is spells of going forth by day, can be applied in a number of different ways. So for example, here at the upper horizontal line, it's this introductory passage describing this papyrus. But also notice here in this vertical column, this is the title for spell 2. And these numbers that I'm using when I say spell 2, that's again a modern designation born in the middle of the 19th century that we still use today just for ease of reference. This spell 2, it also is called a spell for going forth by day. So notice that that title, spell of going forth by day, is not a technical title for the Book of the Dead, but rather a sort of characterization. And in fact, spell of going forth by day can be applied to a wide variety of texts, not just the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead, but other ancient Egyptian funerary compositions as well. Now, when we look at this papyrus or papyri from this period, they follow what's often referred to as the Saite recension. That is a sort of standardized version of the Book of the Dead that comes into use somewhere around, let's say, 700 BC. And what you see here at the beginning is a long illustration above the spells. And this illustration is sort of showing basically the funerary rituals associated with Irtyuru's burial and then what happens next. So you can see in the middle that Irtyuru's mummy is inside of a shrine. On either side stand Isis and Nephthys, the goddess who resurrected Osiris in the mythology. That shrine is being dragged to his tomb, where people are carrying offerings and making offerings, including the foreleg of a bull, and they're making sacrifices. You can see here that the opening of the mouth and purification rituals are being performed on the mummy, which is being held up in an upright position by Anubis. And notice, just following that, in this section here, we have Irtyuru standing before Osiris, and on the other side, Irtyuru standing before the god Re. This is sort of bookending or showing for you the theology that's behind the ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. that the deceased wanted to join with the gods, particularly with the power of resurrection that Osiris represented, so that they could then be reborn in the day and travel around with the sun god. And you can see in the middle of them a figure that represents the sky with a beetle along its body. This is the newly born sun, Khepri, and again, associating this imagery with the rejuvenation of Irtyuru in the afterlife. So sometimes this is referred to as the solar Osirian theology, referring to both the god Osiris and Re as poles on a continuum. That is, Osiris being in the netherworld, Re being in the world of the living, traveling through the sky. And you'll see here in just a second how that ties into the deceased existence in the afterlife. This particular spell that these illustrations are over here is part of spell 15 and actually moving into spell 17. And you can see in the large illustration here in the middle of the screen with the sun and the two goddesses, this we usually refer to as BD spell 16. BD spell 16 is just this illustration. It's actually an illustration that goes with the sun hymns of spell number 15. But notice at the top of the papyrus, you see the little papyrus boat right here. And not only is Irtyuru here worshiping the gods, but now he is inside the boat with the sun god. So he's joining with this divine retinue. And this was sort of the main wish that people like Irtyuru, ancient Egyptians, had for them in the next world, is to join with the gods in this eternal cycle of regeneration. We can see that very specifically if we scroll through this papyrus to other spells. So for example, this set of spells here, notice again, we have a compilation of spells on sort of similar topics grouped together. These are often called the transformation spells because, as you can see from their illustrations, the spells were sort of designed, at least in theory, in ritual, to allow the person using the spell to temporarily take on the identity or the symbolism of these various divine creatures. The most specific one for the theology we're discussing here is Book of the Dead spell 80, which you're looking at here. And notice the title, it's literally called a spell for turning into a god or making the manifestation of a god and creating light. So this really sort of summarizes in a way the theology of the Book of the Dead for the deceased to turn into a god. Likewise, the spell next to it in this particular papyrus is a spell for turning into the god Ptah. So you can see there's this theology here focused on basically the divination of the deceased. And what the ultimate goal of these spells are, you can see in these illustrations here, is the deceased wants to be able to leave the tomb during the day, join with the sun god in the solar bark in the sky, come back to his tomb at night, and rejuvenate through his Osirian form in the form of a mummy. And that's what you see in these illustrations. Here you see the ba. This is a human-headed bird. It's symbolic for the deceased and the deceased ability for movement, coming back and alighting or rejoining with the deceased mummy, because the deceased mummy is mummified. It's their Osirian form. It's how they have taken on the form of Osiris. And by reuniting with the mummy, the ba bird or the deceased in general is able to reappear, rejuvenate the next day in the sky, just like Re. The god Re actually goes down into the netherworld. He joins with the god Osiris there. The god Osiris, being a personification of the power of rejuvenation, provides the sun with the power to arise again the next morning. So here you see the ba joining with the corpse, the ba being free for movement, and the ba being able to leave the spell for opening the tomb chamber. So here actually a spell to make sure that the ba is able to leave from this space. So what you can see in just the selection of spells that we've already looked at is that the Book of the Dead has a lot of different genres: hymns to the sun, spells for transforming into divine creatures, spells to ensure safe travel and movement. And what this should show you is that the often popular characterization of the Book of the Dead as sort of a guide to the afterlife is only partially accurate. There's a lot of other genres of spells within the Book of the Dead. Now, certainly there are sections that are sort of a guide to the geography of the afterlife. One of the most famous is the one that you see here. This is Book of the Dead spell 110. This shows the deceased in an area that's referred to as either the field of reeds or the field of offerings. And parts of this spell say things like this: when you're in this land, you will continue to do what you did on earth. And based on those descriptions, sometimes in more popular literature, you'll see characterizations of the Egyptian afterlife as being an extension of life on earth. And in some ways it is. Clearly, ancient Egyptians envisioned themselves looking like they did on earth and sort of being able to act like they did on earth in the next world. But notice there's a lot of additional enigmatic and mysterious qualities to this existence in the netherworld beyond sort of mundane everyday activities. While you look at the illustration that we see here for Book of the Dead spell 110, lots of characterizations note that the deceased is shown growing grain, and the grain grows very, very tall, and it's very, very plentiful. But this is not just everyday activities. Notice that's what's happening here for Irtyuru, is that he's growing grain in front of a series of gods and actually offering some of that grain in bundles in the top of the illustration to the sun god. Actually, what happens in the field of offerings is this is where the food for the gods are grown, and the deceased takes part in that growing. This is actually the work that Book of the Dead spell 6 for the Ushupti avatars is meant to activate. They activate those Ushuptis in order to do this work to help the deceased as an avatar of the deceased. And then because the deceased is joining the divine retinue, not only are they growing the offerings for the gods, but also themselves as part of that larger divine retinue. So this is one sort of area of existence in the next world for the deceased. But there's lots of others, perhaps the most famous being the Hall of Osiris. That's the illustration associated with Book of the Dead spell 125, where the heart is weighed against a feather of Mot, and the scales should balance. And as long as they balance, then the deceased is declared justified and able to move freely throughout the rest of the underworld, but then also be reborn the next day into the sky. And you can see parts of this journey in later spells, such as these in the 140s, where on the right side and in the middle, there's shown gods who are protectors or guardians at various gates. These gods kept out the uninitiated. They didn't let the uninitiated pass. But someone like Irtyuru, who hoped to be part of the divine retinue, would be allowed past so that they could eventually make it into the sunlight in the morning. And there's the spell, like in sections in spell 149 and 150 that you see here, that give characterizations of various geographical locations called mounds. And you can see the very fantastic images of the gods that are associated with some of these places. They have snake heads, etc. And of course, this is part of the mysteries of the next world and the next life that Irtyuru and ancient Egyptians hope to navigate. So it's sections like this that have led to these characterizations of the Book of the Dead as a guide to the afterlife. But we should just recognize that this is only part of what the whole Book of the Dead is about. This is one section, let's say, of it. And there's lots of additional material there. Now, this papyrus we're looking at, the Papyrus of Irtyuru, or what we call sometimes Papyrus Milbank, it has just over 120 spells in it and is over 30 feet long, as I mentioned. We can look at another papyrus, the Papyrus of Neshu Tefnut, which you see at the bottom of the screen here. This particular papyrus, it has about 160 spells on it. It's roughly contemporary with the Papyrus of Irtyuru, so it's also from around 200 BC. This one was purchased in Paris in 1919 by James Henry Breasted. You can see here on the screen that it's fragmentary, and the first few sheets fragments of the papyrus sheets that we now know about. And this is from the work of University of Chicago graduate student Brian Kramer, who identified some of these. We have one fragment that's in the Columbia University Library, and then a large set of fragments here from the Spokane Public Library. And these are the beginning of the papyrus that was only recently identified by Brian. But the large section of this papyrus is now in the Oriental Institute Museum, starting with Book of the Dead spell 16 throughout to the end. Now, one thing I want to show you here about the Book of the Dead is that it's not canonical in the way we tend to think of canonical text. Each manuscript was handmade, and as a handmade product, each one is unique. No two are exactly alike. Even two that are very similar, no two are exactly alike. And you can see that on this section of Neshu Tefnut's papyrus, where, for example, here we have Book of the Dead spell 30 and 30b, the spell that's associated with the heart scarab. And then on the other side of a middle column, we have spell 31 against these four crocodiles. So notice that then in the middle, we have a spell that's separating them, Book of the Dead spell 64. Now, before we look closer at that, I just want to point out that you can see here very clearly how these spells are grouped together into groups. So notice on the left that we have spells associated with repelling noxious creatures. Now, Neshu Tefnut's papyrus, it's actually really nice because it illustrates for us a couple of key features. One, it has several pieces of evidence that allow us to reconstruct the sequence of production of the papyrus. So first, we know that the sheets of papyrus were put together, and the sheets here on Neshu Tefnut's papyrus are very clear to see. You can see them in these dark bands where the joins of the sheets, the right sheet joining over the left sheet, have been joined together. And you can see that the scroll was put together first because the writing is written right over the joins. So the scroll was put together, and then the scroll was laid out. The text was going to be laid out with this grid. You can see these grid lines delineating where the text and the illustrations were going to be. And then the text was written, and then the illustrations were put in last. And we'll talk about how we know those illustrations were done after the text in just a minute. So looking at this, you can see how some of these spells were grouped together. Here's these spells against noxious creatures. So you see spells against crocodiles, against snakes, against insects, etc. And this shows you how spells on similar topics were grouped together on the papyrus in a section of their own. So these are spells 31 through roughly 40 or so. Now, if we go back and look, I was mentioning that the spells on this papyrus, they don't match the same sequence as every other papyrus. So what you're seeing highlighted here on the screen is spell 64. As I mentioned, it comes in between spell 30 and 31. So what that shows you is that each Book of the Dead papyrus had a unique compilation that was roughly in a unique sequence, in this case with spell 64 inserted here. And one thing that's interesting about spell 64 is it's a spell, according to the title, for knowing all the spells of going forth by day in one spell. So this is a spell to know the Book of the Dead. This demonstrates the ancient Egyptians' sense of redundancy, of always having a backup. So even if the other 160 spells that you have, or so like you have on this papyrus, weren't enough, you had a spell to make sure you knew all the spells in the Book of the Dead. Now, you can also see with this particular papyrus how the scribe very carefully went back and made corrections to the text or insertions by writing above the line. So you can see here in two cases, insertions and corrections where the scribe has gone back and written signs, the hieratic signs, in between the lines that were written first in order to provide a correction. Now, this sequence of events, the scribe writing out the text and then the illustrator coming along and illustrating it, is borne out by a number of interesting features in Neshu Tefnut's papyrus. So for example, if you look here at this particular section on the screen, you'll see that there's a spell and there's a large blank space, a large rectangular blank space underneath the title. So you can see here, the title of the spell is written, there's a blank space, and then the body of the spell. And what's happened here is that the illustrator was going along. There were blank sections in all of these spots for illustrations. And they're going in and they're adding the illustrations to the text. And they simply didn't pay enough attention that there was a spot near the bottom for them to add the illustration. So they skipped one. Well, what that means is that from this spell, the spell for opposing the Merity snake, from this spell on, for a quite long section of the papyrus, the illustrations and the text are out of sync. That is, the spell doesn't have the right image next to it because now the illustrator is out of sequence. They're dropping the wrong image with the wrong text. And you can see as we go forward, other spots where the scribe missed other places for illustration. They're clearly sort of not paying close attention to the lower section of the papyrus, and they're missing these spaces where illustrations were supposed to be added, which shows you that the text was done first. The other thing that the illustrator tries to do at some point, and you can see here, he starts adding 2 illustrations per spell, perhaps in an effort to sort of catch up so that he can get the illustrations back in sequence with the text. If you're wondering, why didn't the illustrator just read the spell and add the appropriate image? I'll explain why here in just a second. So you can see that the illustrator here is trying to sort of cram extra illustrations in order to catch up with the sequence. But even though they're trying hard, you can still see here's 2 more examples where they missed the illustrations. And next to this, a column where the scribe has skipped the column. Probably, we don't know for sure, but probably because you can see how the join where the sheet of papyrus on the right overlaps the sheet of papyrus on the left, the join is very uneven and wavy. Presumably, the scribe didn't want to try to write over that because it would make his writing a little bit messier. So he skips it and continues after this join to avoid this wavy patch. But the illustrator went ahead and illustrated the top of this column anyway, which just suggests that the illustrator is working from some kind of list that says, for the next empty space, put in this picture. And then for the next empty space, put in the next picture. And that's how the papyrus was illustrated, that the illustrator is not reading the spells. So what we have in a further section of the papyrus is a really interesting example that's fairly rare. You don't find it on a lot of these papyri. And this has been pointed out by people like Mark Smith at Oxford University. At the bottom here of this particular section, you can see this set of spells. And you can see in the center, there's a bit of a blank space with a line of writing in it. What we have here is Book of the Dead spell 137. The scribe couldn't quite fit it into the column. So notice here that these 2 lines, these are overrun from Book of the Dead spell 137 here. So he couldn't quite fit them in, so he put them to the left. Then when he went to write spell 140, that's what we see here. When it came to an end, notice that it framed in this rectangle, which to the illustrator would look like a blank space in order to put in an illustration, very much like the other blank spaces we've seen previously, or the blank space for the illustration you see here. But this space was accidental. It just happened to be framed in because of the overrun of the previous spell. So what the scribe does is he writes a note to the illustrator to explain, you shouldn't put a picture here. And what this note says is, it is not a space for a picture. Literally telling the illustrator, don't put an image in this spot. Now, I know you're asking, if the illustrator can read this, why didn't they just read the spells next to it and put in the correct pictures? Well, there's a couple things to keep in mind. The spells that you see written here in these columns, number one, they're written in hieratic, so it's a different script. This note is written in Demotic, but they're also written in a different phase of the ancient Egyptian language. They have very different grammar. The spells that you see written in hieratic here, they were first written down roughly in about 1600 BC. That's when these spells were first created in the Book of the Dead version, as we call it. Now remember that this particular manuscript is from about 200 BC. That means the grammar of these texts written in hieratic at this time in 200 BC was almost 1400 years old. So you can imagine how archaic and different the language was 1400 years prior. So presumably the illustrator didn't have the specialized training required to actually read this Middle Egyptian hieratic text. But it does seem that they were literate, but literate in Demotic, the contemporary phase of the ancient Egyptian language for 200 BC, so that the scribe could write this note to the illustrator, "It is not a space for a picture," in order to avoid some of these syncing issues that we've seen earlier in this particular papyrus. So what we can see here is a really nice example of how these manuscripts were not generally the product of a single individual, but of a workshop, a team of individuals all working together to put this manuscript together. And it would have taken quite some time. Obviously, you have over 100 spells, lots of illustrations, 30 feet of papyrus. It's not a very short job. This would take weeks to months to produce one of these papyri. And the workshop personnel are working very diligently to put these together carefully. So for example, the whole papyrus itself, you can see is sort of bookended by its theology. That is, at the beginning, in spells 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you have this long vignette, which is sort of showing the initial funerary preparations and funerary rituals on behalf of the deceased. When you get to the end of many of these papyri from this period, you see spell 162, a spell for causing a flame under the head of the deceased. That is making them like the god Re. And in the spell, the cow of heaven, which is the image that you see here, the illustration for the spell, calls out to the deceased, "Be like Re, come out into the sky." That is the beginning of the papyrus. The illustration showed you the beginning of the transformation for the deceased, that movement into the tomb and the necropolis just prior to rebirth and those funerary rituals, whereas bookended at the end of the papyrus is a spell for rejuvenation, so that the deceased could be reborn again in the sky with Re, showing you the very careful organization of the papyrus materially to match the theology behind it. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this presentation of the Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead. And as it says here at the end of the Papyrus of Neshu Tefnut, EUF Pu, the end. Thank you very much.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.